All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Diana Butler Bass.
Hey,
And
Trip.
we're going to have some Advent excitement. Advent excitement.
How about some adventure?
Adventure. We can do that as well. Diana, when we were talking about doing Advent together, when we were brainstorming titles, we had so many possible titles. I think I've put all of them in emails at some point to then go back and have to change it.
Yeah, what is the title today?
Well, I know we're talking about the Gospel of Matthew, but it is the beginning of another world, Advent against Empire. And for all of you who've already signed up and such, thank you. We're very excited. Make sure you check your email, and you'll be able to join the Facebook group if you want to. Get a link where you can watch all of these after the fact. You can send questions to respond to any of the class emails. If you have it, you can sign up at homebrewclasses.com. And one of the other things to know about is this isn't just the beginning of the Advent class, the beginning of the church year. It's the beginning of a church year. Diana's brand new book is going through the whole thing, and it's a beautiful year.
It is a beautiful year.
Oh, yeah.
So I hope that people will see the connections between the places in my conversation with you and what I wrote in A Beautiful Year. And then also more broadly, we've got some fun things going that are separate from this homebrew class, but nevertheless kind of related to it over my Substack, The Cottage, which is a completely different sign up. But if you're here, you probably got an email from me with a free version of my Substack in it. And that's just part of signing up for a homebrew class where I'm one of the teachers, is we just put you on my list. And so welcome to The Cottage as well. And, you can keep a free membership or become a paid member, and that's completely up to you.
Yeah. So the format for each of these, each week we're going to look at one of the four gospels with the larger challenge of Advent and what it means today. During it or before, you're welcome to send questions. If you're putting them in the chat, put the word question in caps before you put it, because there are quite a few people that like to hang out and chat. And we love for you to do that as long as you're being nice. But we can't read them all while doing this and remember what we're doing. So if you put question in there, then I'll know to star it and then pull them up at the end when we do Q&A. The format, we're taking turns introducing the different gospels and the things, looking at them, asking the questions around Advent and the kind of counter narrative and time that's going on. Then we'll talk back and forth, and then we'll start answering questions. So you can put questions in at any point, and I'll be saving them till the Q&A time. Other than that, I mean, I think we're good to go. Diana. So you wanted Matthew, and Matthew, the first gospel, though not the oldest, is up first. So I'm gonna let you take it away.
Okay, and I just dropped my Bible, Trip, so you're gonna have to let me lean over and pick it up.
Well, I'm sure there are certain people on the internet that might see that as a sign as theological depravity that we're bringing.
Well, I was thinking about a time when I actually dropped it in the Bible church that I attended when I was 15 years old, but we can go on that story some other time. Okay.
And maybe say something about our framing too, because I know it's connected to your book and we talked about it on the podcast, but just to remind everyone.
Oh, you want me to say something about framing?
Yeah. Because, we're the militarism, nationalism, that whole.
Oh, yeah. The way that I approach the Christian year in A Beautiful Year, and the way that I think, Trip, you and I sort of naturally started developing a sort of theological conversation around these themes anyway, is that I look at A Beautiful Year through three lenses. And those three lenses are: how do you read the Bible and from an anti-empire perspective? How do you read it from a nonviolent or an anti-militarist perspective? And how do you read it with the eye toward creation? and towards the beauty of the world, the wholeness of the world. And so, in that sense, the three frames that I am bringing to my work are those: anti-imperialism, nonviolence, and sort of eco wholeness. And you and I like talking about scripture and theology through those lenses, and those are the lenses of A Beautiful Year, and those are the lenses I'm going to be bringing to Matthew and John, which are my two assignments this month.
All righty, excellent. Well, I'm gonna make myself really small and use my listening face.
Great. Well, goodbye, Trip. I see you in the corner. I am really excited today to be able to talk about the first two chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. There's a funny question that people sometimes ask. They say, what's your favorite gospel? And you're supposed to pick one of the four. And for years and years and years, I said, oh, Luke. And I think that Luke is a very popular choice, especially among people kind of like me, who consider themselves more liberal, progressive Christians. But in the last couple years, I have come to love Matthew and John. And that's also a little bit of an odd choice, that John choice, because that's a popular gospel, interestingly enough, to be read with evangelicals. But I want to start here, Matthew, which is the first book in the New Testament, even though it is not the oldest of the Gospels. And I think that it's very interesting that it is the first gospel. The way it begins is quite simple, and I do have my Bible, which is a big and heavy book, sitting right here, so it's lacking balance, I got to tell you. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And I remember the very first ever Bible class that I had on an advanced academic level was an introduction to New Testament class, which happened in the fall of my first year in college. I went to a Christian college, and everyone was required to take New Testament and Old Testament and a couple other religion classes along the way. And so the professor got up. He happened to be an expert in the Gospel of Matthew, and wound up writing a book about Matthew that was pretty controversial. And the first words out of his mouth in that class about any of the Gospels were, "The Gospel of Matthew is the most Jewish of all the Gospels." And I can remember at 18 years old just kind of sitting there and thinking, what? Huh? Why are we talking about this? And it's been that point that over the last 40 years has been the point that has slowly sunk into my soul and helped me understand why this is really important. And that's the way I want to read it today with you. This whole theme of Advent against empire, and thinking about beginnings and endings. So we begin with these simple words. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. Some copies of the Bible, some translations say this is the narrative of Jesus the Christ. Christ and Messiah, basically the same word. The word Christos simply means the anointed one or the Messiah. And I went a little further and checked out the Greek and its relationship to the Hebrew. And the dictionary actually says properly the word Christos means, and this is the technical definition whenever you see the word Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so that is what this book is about. And that's a packed sentence just right there. And the way that Matthew presents the birth narrative of this Messiah in these first two chapters is pretty stunning. And it opens almost like a stage play. And so this is the kind of thing you're going to get from someone who is a writer as well. The plot is, so you have the narrative, you have the theme of what we're going to be doing. We're looking at this Messiah. But then there's a plot that's associated with this Messiah. And the plot is this dramatic story that we're going to follow through in all the pages of this book. And the plot is based on a dualism. Now, some people don't like dualisms, but I'm sorry, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew loved dualisms. And the primary dualism is this age versus the age to come. And those two terms, this age and the age to come, is language that is used for a shorthand phrase that Jesus will employ a lot, and that other gospel writers will employ quite a bit as well. And that is the kingdom. This age is the age of the world. This age is what we're in right now. And it's gloomy, it's corrupt. The world is not as it should be. And then there's this hope for the age to come. And the age to come is the great vision of the kingdom, the kingdom, the beloved community, whatever language you want to use there. But the Jewish idea is that one day the world will be as God has dreamed it, that there will be justice and mercy, will kiss one another, that there will be healing and fullness and wholeness and intentionality of love throughout the whole of the universe, that all of the hoped for visions of God will be fulfilled. And the society itself will be structured around Sabbath, an alternative economy, and a different sense of work, and Jubilee, a form of complete communal equality and freedom and non-slavery to either debt or to other people. And so that's the primary contrast, this age and the age to come. The style of the gospel is fascinating. And I had to do more than a little bit of homework to prepare to talk to Tripp about this, is that if it is the most Jewish gospel, well, what kind of Jewish writing is this? And there's a big argument among scholars as to what form this story about Jesus the Messiah takes. There's not much argument about the dualism or the kingdom of God, but the one that I find most interesting is there's some suggestions that this is Jewish apocalyptic literature that is interwoven with Jewish wisdom literature. And as such, you have this apocalyptic encounter about the end of this world and the beginning of the age to come. And so that's the vibrancy of the drama, is the apocalyptic vision that's under here. It's not apocalypse like things blowing up or four horsemen or the book of Revelation. It's a different vision of apocalypse. It's the kind of apocalyptic literature where God's purposes are finally going to defeat the purposes and the corruption of this world. And so that is an apocalyptic framework. But then the idea of that it being interlinked with wisdom is fascinating to me, because Jesus both is the hinge in the story as the person and the embodiment of God's purpose, that we move from this age to the age to come. So where Jesus is the hinge, as it were, of history. Some people say Jesus was a wisdom teacher. And Matthew doesn't really present Jesus as a wisdom teacher. Matthew presents Jesus as wisdom herself. And so when Jesus speaks, it's more than just Jesus saying, oh, this is wisdom, follow this way. It's when Jesus is speaking, Jesus is the voice of wisdom. And there are several places throughout the gospel where there are very subtle claims that Matthew puts in Jesus' mouth that really identify him with wisdom. So now the birth narrative itself. The birth narrative unfolds in two, I'll call them two acts. So we have this little prologue, and then we have the two acts. The first act is the birth of this wisdom in the world. And then the second act is, let me turn my page real quick so I get the title of it that I wrote down. The second act is the central drama. And that is the setting up of the tension between this age and the age to come. So in the first act, which is also chapter 1, you get this genealogy. Back in evangelicalism, they made a big deal about how this was Joseph's genealogy. And the reason it was different than the one in Luke is that the one in Luke is Mary's genealogy. And so what we had were two genealogies, two biological lines of Jesus. I am not one given to the theory that this is actually a biological genealogy in the sense that somebody would look at ancestry.com and be tracing their DNA and trying to find their family history. Instead, this is a sacred genealogy. And what it is doing is that it lists almost all men. We'll talk about the women in just a minute. It lists almost all men. And if you read the carefully, you'll see that these are the patriarchs, the heroes, and the good kings of Israel. And these are the cool people. These are the righteous people that you read all the stories about in the Hebrew Bible. And that it says that Joseph comes from this genealogy. And so, see, the point should be perfectly clear. And it even says that a little further down, it says that Joseph himself was among the righteous, that he made a choice, a righteous choice, when it came to choosing to marry Mary. And so it's a sacred genealogy of the righteous of Israel, and Joseph is part of that righteousness. There are a few women mentioned in this line, and I think that it's interesting. There are 5 women who are mentioned. They're brought in, and these are kind of the shady girls in the Old Testament. We have Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, who's not even referred to by her own name. She's simply called the wife of Uriah. And if you go back and you read all of these stories about these 4 women in the Hebrew scriptures, you have some pretty wild stories. You have wild stories about incest. You have stories about prostitution. You have stories about seduction, and you have stories about potentially even rape. There's a good argument to be made that that the encounter between David and Bathsheba was not in any way consensual. And so what happens is you have these 4 women with these very conflicted sexual histories, backed up to this long list of these men who are considered to be the righteous of Israel. And yet these are the women they hang around with. And so what is this all about? Well, all of those women are redeemed. All of those women are outsiders. Mostly, I think there's only one of them who is actually an Israelite, and that would be Tamar. But everybody else, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with that, but all of the other ones were mostly all outsiders who were brought into the story through marriage, and they come from other countries. And so these are women who are not born into the promise, but they're incorporated into it, and they're redeemed into it through the participation in God's unfolding story of the righteousness of Israel, and they become the heroines. And I think that's absolutely fascinating, because the patriarchal line is really kind of like a birth line of the good men of the tribes of Israel. But then you have the women who are all brought into that line. And they wind up being incredibly important characters. Now, why would Matthew do that? Well, there was a rumor in the ancient world that Mary had been raped by a Roman soldier, and that was actually where Jesus came from. And that early Christians just invented this whole story about the virgin birth to cover up this really very unpleasant parentage, and that this is why Joseph probably should have put her away. And so this was a story, a piece of gossip that we actually know because it's recorded in other sources outside of the Bible. So it's a historically noted rumor. It is clear that Matthew is trying to address this. I think what Matthew is actually trying to say is that, it wouldn't even matter if the rumor was correct, because look at all these other women. Look at Tamar, look at Rahab, look at Ruth, look at the wife of Uriah, look at Bathsheba. And all of those women participated in the redemption of Israel. All of those women wind up giving birth to people who are in this line of righteousness. And really the conception itself isn't the point. And I think it's fascinating that Matthew decides to go there because Luke does not. Luke ignores this completely, but Matthew tackles it head on. And he said, even if it's true, it does not dismiss who Jesus is or how Jesus stands in the line of righteousness. And then finally, you get to the end of this first chapter and you see the point is that Matthew is trying to say that Jesus, the Messiah, comes from two very important lines. He comes from the line of the righteous, and he comes from the line of the redeemed. And right there, one of the things we know is that whatever this Messiah is going to do, it is going to work in such a way that the righteous and the redeemed are going to walk hand in hand and really create together a new kind of humanity. And so this piece of that first chapter, even though it's so boring, let's skip the genealogy because who wants to read that, fits with the idea of apocalyptic, because the world is corrupt. The world is falling apart. People are sinful in apocalyptic literature, and they are unjust, and they are oppressing one another, and they're fighting. The world is at war. The hope is that God is going to come and save this. And what's God going to save? Oh, there has to be a heroic line in every apocalyptic. And so there needs to be a people, someone who is part of a faithful community that is keeping the wisdom and the law of God, even when the whole of the world is corrupt. And so the idea that Jesus now is part of this line that combines the righteous and the redeemed into a single narrative of a people who are bearing the wisdom of God. And what is the ultimate bearing of the wisdom of God? It's going to be this Messiah. It's going to be God coming into the world as a human being. And what is the name of this Messiah? God with us. Emmanuel. And the point becomes, even in the worst, God has not deserted the world, and God is acting. And acting in the union of these two people, Joseph and Mary, who have now created a family for the Messiah. So that's the first act. The second act, and I'm going to move through this a little faster because I know Tripp really wants to talk about the second act, is the central drama between this age and the age to come. This is the dualism. And so this is the first time that Matthew is really going to introduce it. So he says, okay, there's a sacred line of people. There's a righteous line. There's a line of wisdom that has carried us through to this moment. And we've been waiting for the Messiah, the embodiment of the whole of the line. But why? Why? Well, because there's a war going on between the powers of good and evil, this age and the age to come. And the act in the second chapter focuses on the visit of the magi, which again is completely absent in Luke. We're not going to see this story again. This is the only place it happens. And its main character isn't even a good guy. Its main character is Herod, who is a bad guy. And I love talking about Herod because Herod is the worst. Herod, lots of Christians don't realize that Herod ruled for a very long time, and he actually died in 4 BCE, which means something that we always talk about in graduate school without our eyes batting, is that Jesus was actually born before the beginning of Christian era. And so when we say that Jesus was born in the year 0 and it's AD and BC and all that sort of stuff, no, Jesus had to be born somewhere around 5 or 6 BCE, before the common era, and because he was born under Herod the Great, who is this guy at the beginning of Matthew. Herod the Great is a real person, and Herod the Great wasn't a Jew. Herod was from a rump group of Judaism, from a tribe called the Edomites. And they had a different religion. They're kind of like the Samaritans to the north, but this group is, I believe, to the south. And the Jews didn't like them. So you would say, well, how in the world does Herod get to be king of the Jews? This doesn't make any sense. David is the king of the Jews, and he's a Jew. But no, Herod got to be king of the Jews by not being a real Jew, because Mark Antony, yes, that Mark Antony, the same one who shows up in Cleopatra and in William Shakespeare, that Mark Antony was in what we now know of as Israel. And there was a whole bunch of political machination going on. And Mark Antony suggested to Julius Caesar that Herod be made the king of the Jews, just a rump king on behalf of Caesar. And it passed the Roman Senate. And so you have a guy in Judea, where Jesus is from, his name is Herod, who isn't even a Jew. He pretends to be a Jew. He says he converts to being a Jew. Nobody believes that. Very few people think that that was really true in the ancient world. Some of the historians at the time say, well, if he was a Jew, he was a bad one, because he murdered his own wife. He murdered most of the children that he had in order to be able to protect his own power. And he was out of control. This guy, all he wanted was money and power and the throne. That's it. And he would stop at nothing to make that happen. And so he was a murderer, a cheat, a con man. He was not a person of faith, and he was put there by an empire as a rump king. And so basically this character, Herod, was hated by the Jews because they didn't trust him. And what he was trying to do is he was trying to buy their favor. And so how he used some of the money that he got is he rebuilt the temple. And he also did these massive public works projects all over Jerusalem, like putting up a new ballroom on the palace. I didn't say that, Trip, really. And so this is what he did. And the New Testament actually records different ones of the disciples walking by something that Herod built. And like a few weeks ago, there was the reading about they're walking by the temple, and they look up and they stare at the beauty of the white walls and all of the gold. And so that's what Herod did. He built big white walled golden buildings all over Jerusalem in order to get the Jews to like him and accept him as their king. There was a lot of conflict about that temple because some Jews wouldn't go in it because Herod had built it. And other Jews said, well, honestly, it doesn't matter that Herod is the one who rebuilt the temple. You can still use it anyway. And so there was a fight among the Jews themselves about the credibility of the temple. So Herod is basically, he combines Pharaoh, Caesar, and all of the evil kings of Israel into a single character. And it's Herod who, for the very first time, names Jesus the King of the Jews. Nobody calls Jesus the King of the Jews except for bad guys in the scripture, which is really interesting. And this goes right into Tripp's little pocket about Advent and empire. Because Herod has got in his mind what kingship means. Kingship means power, control, wealth, military prowess, being able to do whatever you want to do, and having essentially eternal life through your own fame. That's what kingship is to Herod. And that's when he hears this baby has been born. He gets really worked up because he thinks that somebody is going to come and take all that away from him and replace him. He's worried about being replaced as king in the exact same way he's already replaced somebody else. And so then you have the unfolding of the story. The Magi are following the star because they hear that the Messiah, this special human being, the divine revelation has been born. And so Herod knows they're coming through town. Herod does not know the name of this baby, where this baby is or anything, but he hears that these Magi are following them. Herod invites them over to the White House, the palace. And then he says, he probably feeds them, maybe gives them a lot to drink. And he says, by the way, where is this baby? Because I would really love to go and worship him. And the wise men, he said, you must tell me when you find the child, come back this way and let me know so that I too can give him homage. And it moves on from that point where, of course, the wise men do indeed go off and find Jesus. But there's a little sort of quoting of the Bible verses right before the wise men arrive at Jesus' birthplace. And that is, there's, let me find it here. It says, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for from you will come a ruler who is a shepherd. And see, now we're getting a hint that Herod has an idea of what kingship is, but God has a different idea. God has the idea of a ruler as a shepherd. Now, that's also pointing to David, King David, and contrasting the bad kings of Israel with David, the good king of Israel. But it's also pointing to the fact that we're going to get a lot of this kind of shepherd language around Jesus in actually all four of the Gospels. So anyway, Herod tries to deceive the wise men. The wise men go off and they do their thing. They worship Jesus. And when they're there, they're warned in a dream not to go back to Herod because Herod is problematic, but they're to go home by another road. And so the wise men do that. They go home by another road. In effect, what happens is Herod tries to deceive the wise men, but the wise men wind up deceiving Herod. And I think that this is a really fascinating story in this idea of the righteous. The wise men are foreigners. The wise men are people who are being brought in. So in a sense, these wise men are almost playing the role of the women in the genealogy in the chapter before. They know what the wisdom is, called wise men even. And yet when they use this deception, when they refuse the command from the king, it's in a sense it's a holy rebellion against the imperial command. And so Herod tries to corrupt them. They are uncorruptible, and they continue to follow the voice of wisdom. There's a consequence. Herod gets so mad that he goes out and he commits this genocide. And this is one of those things that there is no historical evidence that Herod actually murdered all of these infants. But this is one of those moments in the text that you have to say to yourself, why is it there? And you know what? Even if Herod didn't do it, the people who read this story probably believed that Herod would have done it had Herod had the chance or if Herod had thought about it. I mean, that's how bad Herod is that he's going to murder your babies. And if he didn't, he would have given half a chance. And so there's a lot of kinds of moments in history where we as historians, that's what I'm trained as, we actually don't know if something really happened because the story is built up so long around it, but there's no real evidence for it. There's stuff like that with Martin Luther on the 31st of October. It says he hung the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door. Well, you know what? There's no evidence that Martin Luther actually tacked that on the door. We know he wrote the 95 Theses. We know he made a public disputation about it, but we have no idea about that door thing. Yet it's one of what we say about as historians. Well, even if he didn't do it, he might have had he thought about it. And there are moments like that in history where we just sort of have to look at the story and say, this is in keeping with who this character was. And this story of the murder of the innocents is in keeping with who Herod was. He'd already killed his own family. I mean, why not kill a few families you're not related to on top of it? And the point becomes that kings like Herod always do this. They always use violence and gruesome violence, illegal forms of violence, in order to maintain their own power and get their own way and further their own fame and wealth. And so it prefigures the fact, now Jesus escapes because Joseph is also warned in a dream of this massacre and says, take the family away. And Joseph flees with Mary and the baby to Egypt. So the massacre of the innocents prefigures Jesus's execution at the end of the book. Jesus might escape when he's an infant. He's not going to escape the wrath of empire when he's an adult, because this is what Caesar will always do. This is what Herod will always do. This is what evil kings always do. He goes to Egypt with his parents. And I actually have a piece on this that'll come out in 4 weeks at the last Sunday of Advent at the cottage. It's not in a beautiful year, but it's one of my favorite things I've written through the years. I'm playing with it and rewriting it right now. I think that, and this is where I'm going to stop. I think if you were a Jew and you were reading this story and you see this incredible figure of Joseph, who's in the line of the righteous. Essentially, what this story is claiming is that Jesus is is the son of a patriarch. Because our Joseph, the Joseph of the New Testament, stands in the line of all these patriarchs and heroes. And Jesus, as his son, is standing in that line as well. And so you're thinking about Joseph, and you're thinking about this line of righteousness and this line of the patriarchs of Israel. Who are you going to think of? You're going to think of Joseph in Genesis. You're going to be thinking about that story of Joseph. And where did that Joseph wind up? Oh, he went to Egypt. And there were dreams involved and angels. And out of this terrible circumstance, what happens? Israel gets saved. And that is exactly what happens. I think that Matthew is alluding to that whole story here. He's saying that the Joseph, that was Jesus' father, is in effect a kind of a Joseph figure. He's retelling that story of that incredible patriarch, sent off into slavery, into Egypt, renewed by God in the worst of circumstances through a series of dreams. And then Joseph, through his own expression of wisdom and his compassion, creates a pathway for both the people of Egypt to be saved during time of famine and his own family to be saved during a time of famine. And I think that's what Matthew is ultimately saying, is that even in the worst circumstance possible, that God is still active, and that God is going to turn horrendous circumstances toward salvation. The final words we hear from Joseph in Genesis 50, when he's finally talking to his brothers about this, are these: "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about for this day, to save many people." And I think that's the point of the birth narrative of Matthew. A sacred genealogy, putting Jesus in the line of the patriarch patriarchy, the righteous of Israel, and the redeemed brought in from the outside. This line of the faithful standing up to resist the powers of this age and this world in anticipation of the age that is to come. And it's toward that age that is to come that God's purpose is working itself out.
All right. Well, that was fun.
That was fun.
Yeah, so you get the I like the Joseph connection and then Jesus's new Moses connection, both playing out there.
Yeah, see, that's the thing is that you hear the new Moses piece, and I've written about that, myself a good number of times. But I think that the Joseph connection to that Genesis and the line of the patriarchs here is really fascinating, because if you put both of them together, of course, the Moses connection is Moses the lawgiver and Moses the liberator. And in fact, the Joseph connection is Joseph is the faithful, wise, righteous one who was wronged, but nevertheless is saved.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really a vision of salvific power of God. So you have the liberative through Moses, but then the salvific through Joseph. And I love it, because there's just the connections are myriad. I think if you indeed are a Jew who would be reading this story, you would be making all synapses would be firing. Because you would recognize all of these stories in these two short chapters. Really, I mean, this is not that long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The one of the things about Joseph that always sticks out to me is it's very clear, if you're engaged to someone who's pregnant and you're not the father, that if you are being, in scare quotes, biblical, you have an opportunity to disgrace her publicly, to end the engagement, and all those kinds of things. And so one of the fascinating things about Joseph is that he's choosing a kind of mercy and spaciousness to let the story unfold, a kind of quiet protection, very much everyone can guess the kind of humiliation that's entailed in him remaining faithful to her throughout the whole pregnancy and such. When you have him, as the stepdad of sorts, it actually makes sense with when you think of how Jesus has this deep love for Torah running throughout the gospel. Right in Matthew, you get Jesus telling everyone, you can't even change the vowel endings on Torah. I don't want you messing with this. Like some of those other gospel writers weren't nearly as Jewish as me. You can't change vowel endings. But there's also he has this different way of embodying or being faithful to Torah, which is in that kind of a merciful form of righteousness.
And I think that's very reflective of many of the characters who are in the sacred genealogy. If you go through and you look at them, and they're not people who are perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and they are people who face tremendous travail and suffering, oftentimes persecution themselves, but nevertheless are part of this line of faithfulness. And some of them, especially as you get down to the lower names in the history, some of them are people like you going, who is this? What is this story about? And that proves that I think that the point that you're making about when it comes to the community of the righteous in this dualistic apocalyptic world, things don't always turn out as they expect. And it is oftentimes the quiet work of some of these people that is the work that carries the line of wisdom most fully forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the other things, and this came up in the chat, I mean, even about David being the good king, right? In a genealogy that has the raping of Bathsheba echo in the genealogy. I think one of the other elements when you're thinking about the nature of mercy and righteousness and its relationship is David's the identification of David as a good king is not that he was perfect. the encounter with Nathan and these kinds of things, it doesn't mean that there weren't consequences for his actions. I mean, we know what happens with his with his kids, and with the nation of Israel, with his grandkids and such. And so, there's this this kind of I think there's a kind of tendency, especially in our own moment, probably intensified by how things play out in hyper partisan, algorithmically mediated ways, of picking some, what was the worst things you've ever done in your life? Now we're going to make that the archetype of who you are.
Right.
And one of the gifts of the Hebrew scriptures is the full picture of people and the recognition that, we are more, there's more potential in who we are than our worst mistakes. And that's not a legitimate reason to avoid honesty and transparency and the struggle of dealing with the consequences.
Yeah, and I love that part, and I also love the part in the genealogy about the women, because their flaws are pretty underscored in the scripture, and yet, and most of them were foreigners, and I think that's just a really beautiful piece of this sacred genealogy, is that it is not ethnically defined. And so not every person who is an Israelite winds up in this genealogy. It's just this thread of people who have done exactly what you're saying, and faithfulness is not dependent upon your ethnic background, but your strict being just born into a tribe. Is that starts the process, that in a sense initiates the covenant, but you have something to do about it here too. And all these people made choices, and David notably made lots of bad ones, but he still is the greatest king of Israel. And so that's I think that's just really worth considering and thinking about too. And I mean, he and Bathsheba lost that first baby. I mean, that's the baby died, the infant that they conceived in that horrible circumstance. And so, I mean, why would that be the case? Poor woman, she's under so much horrifying stress. I can't even imagine. But then the second child, after this passes by and whatever work they did in therapy, winds up being Solomon, right? Yeah. So, yeah, and that's the second greatest king in all of Israel, and a wisdom figure. So it's like, well, David, little, kind of half-assed wisdom figure, but Solomon, we got a full-on embodiment. And sometimes I've been playing within my own mind, what this says about, like, Joseph and then Jesus. So the Father and the Son, and anyway, I think that it's a really good part of the story, and I don't think that we should ignore it. And I think that it's intriguing that most of Matthew's, huge portion, what is it, a third of Matthew's birth narrative is on that genealogy. I mean, that's there's just the tiniest bit right after the genealogy that says, and Joseph did these things, and then the baby was born, period. there's no there's no taxation, there's no going from to Bethlehem to be enrolled, or there's no stable, there's no animals lowing, there's no angels. There are angels showing up in dreams, there are visions, there's mystical experiences around this, but it's not as heraldic, I don't know how you would say that, as the Luke, which you're going to get to do in a little bit, which I think is a fascinating. The Luke Matthew contrast is actually, I think, more fascinating than the Luke Matthew synthesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you essentially in both Matthew and Luke, you get a virgin conception in Bethlehem, and then, well, no, the characters. But there's a whole lot. There's not a lot else in common. There was a conversation. A number of people asked about the rumor of Mary and such. And I'll just here's what I remember, and you can tell me what remembers in your head. I know it was Celsus who was writing kind of anti-Christian polemics in the 2nd century, who oftentimes in it is taking what he knows from the narratives we have in canonical and non-canonical gospels and kind of like reworking them or retelling them and filling in gaps and stuff. And there you get the story of Mary conceiving from a Roman soldier, identified as like Panthera. I remember it as almost Pantera. That's
Yeah.
how dyslexia works. Is I was like, it's almost Pantera because I called him Pantera in class, and my teacher was like, "It's Panthera." Anyway, but which is also like a word that's playfully used, like it's used towards Roman soldier and maybe not a proper name. But that tradition emerges after the Gospel of Matthew as like a kind of narrative rebuttal. And one of the fascinating things when kind of looking at 2nd and 3rd century kind of back and forths around the identity of Jesus, or what parts of the gospel stories do the opponents treat as facts to be explained otherwise, right? So that is mom's Mary. Most people know this. So then the real question is, well, who's his real dad, right? Or you take that. Or in one of the other counter gospels, Jesus sneaks into the Holy of Holies. This is in the end of the 2nd century. He's not supposed to go in there, and cuts his leg open, writes down God's real name, puts it in a piece of paper, sews his
I
leg
don't
back
know
up,
this one.
And when you leave, there are angels that blow in your ears, and you don't remember God's name for the one time you really go in there a year if you're the right high priest. And now that's how he was doing all the miracles, because he stole the holy name, and he was doing them of God, but it was stolen. Right. So you can see, like there's this whole like one of the fascinating things about using them when asking a question like this, is it historical, is, well, we have no idea, but we do know that Matthew, composed in the 80s most likely, was now popular enough and known that anti-Christian polemicists are going, where are the holes in this? How could we explain this? They're not debating whether Jesus was a miracle worker. They're going, well, here's how he did it. They're not explaining where was his mom really Mary. They're going, well, how did she really conceive? Yeah.
And it's pretty clear that the rumor was around. And so, that's one of the things that if you think about early Christian literature, there are huge gaps. I mean, we don't have a lot. Sometimes you have to build an entire case if you have a PhD in early Christian stuff on a scrap of text this big, that has been found in some garbage dump in Egypt. And so when you see something being written in the 2nd or 3rd century, what you can probably assume is that it was floating around for a long time before it reached that desk and somebody, wrote it down. So I think that the gossip was, most historians do believe that the gossip was there early, and that it does seem like Matthew is already sort of pre-addressing. He's trying to stop it in its tracks, I think. And he's saying, well, yeah, sure, that's a story you can tell, but even if you tell that story, it doesn't ultimately affect the larger story that is being told about Jesus the Messiah and this drama between this age and the age that is to come, between Herod and, as a stand-in for Caesar, and Jesus, the innocent one. And it's so I think that that whole business, what we don't know, we don't know for sure, how any of this happened. But what we do know is that there was a rumor of this in the ancient world, and that rumor gets written down as a criticism, or just a, sort of an explanation about Christianity in a later century, as you say. And I think that's fascinating, that a rumor gets confirmed in that sense. not to be true, but that the rumor existed, that we know an ancient rumor. I mean, why would we know an ancient rumor? You know, somebody heard it, they wrote it down.
And I'd say, like, one of the origin points of the rumor, right? Matthew's reading Mark before it in chapter 6 of Mark, and now I don't have to say this next week, is there's this bit where Jesus shows up, his family, he goes to Nazareth, and the townspeople go, "Oh, that's the carpenter Mary's son." And
right.
When you say the carpenter's Mary's son, if we know who your dad is and it's a legitimate birth, you go,
Joseph's
it's the
son.
carpenter, Joseph's son.
Right.
And so if that's the older version, you can see how the moment that's there, you raise a question. Well, is he really Joseph's son? Whose son is he? And then you get a different answer. Well, Joseph wasn't his dad because it was a virgin conception, or virgin conception. Let me tell you where this came from. Yeah, you can see how this is playing out. And remember, they have there are so few literate individuals that are involved in this. The reproduction of text, it's not like they're sitting around like we can with all these multiple versions of a gospel, seeing how it developed, coming up with the best version of the text. There's this huge mixture of oral traditions. There at this point, the diversity in early church within the early church is huge. There's other narratives around Joseph and Mary forming. Like if you think of stuff around the infancy gospel of Thomas, Joseph has a lot more prominent role. So they haven't been canonized to go which ones are we going with yet. So it's when we're doing the kind of history time machine bit, it is you can pinpoint facts as a historian that very few of the people that are even deciding what to say then have access to. So
and I think it is fun to consider for a moment that, okay, so Matthew is writing a story about Jesus. And so he's, when you look at the story, it's set, and, it starts about 5 BCE. And Matthew is taking it up to right after the death of Herod. So 3 or 2 BCE, because it says after Herod died, the family then returned to Nazareth. That's the last bit of chapter 2. And his son came to the throne, and the one of them that he hadn't killed, and he was an awful figure. I mean, he really does put some of the evil kings in the Old Testament to shame. He's that bad. And so you have Matthew is writing a story that is set all before the year roughly 30 in the Common Era. But yet Matthew is writing that story. Whoever this author is of the Gospel of Matthew is writing this story around 80. And so what's happened between 30 and 80 is also in play. And anyone who knows the history of the early church, and this is important for our theme, is that all of the Gospels were, I believe all of them, were produced after the temple was destroyed, after Herod's temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. There was a big Roman Jewish war in the middle part of the first century, and Rome won. And so Matthew is sort of writing in the shadow of being part of an oppressed people through history, the Jewish community, and the time of Jesus, the tension between Jesus and Caesar. But then he's writing in a time of history when it seems like the apocalypse went the wrong way. And so you have now all of these questions. Well, wait a second. Where is the kingdom of God? Jesus promised this thing. We thought that he was the wisdom teacher, the last one in the line, that he's going to bring forth the kingdom. And meanwhile, the temple is laying in ruins, and Jews are scattering far and wide. And the Jewish corner of the Christian corner of Judaism is really an embattled minority. And you can actually see that in the text itself as well, as you see this tension emerging between Christian Jews and Jews who have decided that they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And so the apocalyptic setting is very strong. The dualism sense, the good versus bad, and the question of, well, why does evil triumph time after time, is also, I think, present in Matthew. And these are kinds of almost we can hear an echo of those kinds of questions, I think, in contemporary Jewish theology, because there's a way in which the destruction of the temple was the Holocaust, as it were, of the first century, just to use that kind of very dramatic language, but I think you could make that case. And then you have now the post-Holocaust tradition in Judaism, and you can hear the same echoes. You can hear echoes of doubt, of identity, of what does faithfulness do for you? Will this ever end? And yet there is also the real pointed ability to be able to define evil over and against injustice and oppression and beauty and gratitude and all of the virtues, as it were, of Jewish thought. And so I think that this whole text is rich in those ways. So I don't know how much more you want to go with, Trip.
Well, we got here. We got one more question on the first half, because you divided it in 2 acts.
I did. Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple questions around this theme, but how much of Matthew writing in the women in the genealogy is a statement also against the patriarchal system and the whole system of women not having power?
I think it is more of a statement than what people usually make it out to be. This is one of the reasons I like Matthew. I think the quick and sort of dirty version of Matthew versus Luke on this point is that Luke is more open to women, that Luke is the more feminist of the Gospels. And, I'm kind of uncomfortable with that, especially, well, there are parts of Luke that are really sexist. And Matthew, I think, is working hard here to say that the history of the righteous in Israel would not be possible without these women. And that's a big deal. So in effect, he's adding his genealogy is adding a matriarchal dimension to what is usually just a patriarchal practice. And so I'd say I'm going to give him a lot of points for that.
Yeah. If people are interested in pursuing that more, Phyllis Tribble, who recently passed away, one of my professors at Wake Forest Div School, somewhere she did a lecture or article on the women in Matthew's genealogy. And
I have some vague memory of that too.
And I remember being blown away at it. And one of the points that that she makes, and someone else even made this in the chat, is today we have such a different culture that we get drawn to this unique fact that there are women in this at all. And then, look at these scandalous stories of who's named in it, and going on and on. And then she pauses and goes, but I'd like to begin by just listing off the names of men who broke at least 5 of the commandments.
In the genealogy?
That are in the genealogy. Yeah.
Yeah, and, like I said, those guys are not perfect.
Right. and so she does this, and then it goes this, and so and she goes, you could say that the genealogy is a story that men have a long history of poor decisions leading to violence, destruction, terror, and the breaking of integrity, and that women who get labeled all sorts of things ultimately bring about the incarnate one.
Right.
Yeah. And
the
so
of God.
Yeah, it's sometimes the noticing just the fullness of humanity that's woven into that genealogy is.
I love that genealogy. I mean, if we have to read a genealogy, that was a great one to read.
Yeah, and one of the things we'll notice in a few weeks is it goes to Abraham. That's the genealogy, and Luke's goes all the way to Adam, and they take very different routes. So
and I think that's very cool. I mean, this is really, Jesus is being put in a family, in a tribe, and in a community, and that community is the community from which this line of righteousness will come, that is going to give birth to the fullness of the age to come, to fullness of the kingdom of God. And it's going to be an alternative. It's not going to be a kingdom like Caesar's, like Herod's kingdom. It's going to be a reign of a shepherd.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I really think to myself at that point, you go, okay, you know, in what universe do we think about the word king and think the word shepherd in the same sentence? You know, I mean, it's just so we're being alerted to the fact that in effect the idea of worldly kingship is about to be deconstructed. I mean, it's really about to be destroyed in this apocalyptic encounter. Is that no king on the scope of Herod will be possible again after the Messiah arrives. And that becomes, of course, Matthew's problem, when it seems like Caesar's getting worse and worse and worse down the road. And wait a second, this is the story we treasure. This is the story we live in. This is our identity. So how do I tell this where it makes any sense at all? And so Matthew's already weaving us, not only, I mean, he's weaving us into a story that we are asking ourselves today, you know. And I've had people ask me this, you know, how can you stay a Christian? There's lots of reasons why you would ask somebody that question. You know, it's all full of crap. So many Christian nationalists, whatever. But one of the most interesting times people ever ask me that is they say, it just hasn't come true. I can't wait any longer for what Jesus promised as the kingdom of God. And that's the moment when you go, oh, that's what they were talking about, like in the early church, and the couple centuries afterwards. It's like, well, wait a second. Yeah, this is pretty slow. Jesus said that it was all going to be fixed. It's not fixed. And how do we begin to deal with that? I think Matthew has a sense of that problem. And this gospel is one of the baby steps towards some of the theological answers of that problem.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about the genealogy, and also it's a similar thing that you're playing out in the beautiful year about the liturgical calendar, is that it's a narrative. It's a space and time place to kind of find a new orientation and identity.
Right.
And it reminds me of the scene in Two Towers, second book in the Lord of the Rings, where Sam and Frodo are in. I got balloons when I said Lord of the Rings.
I know your computer does the weirdest
it knows
things.
me very well. Where they've lost like all hope. They're in Mordor and they're sitting there and they're running out of food and this kind of thing. And they start talking about the stories they were told. And then they remember these stories. I'm not going to go into them, but Frodo was given this little light vase. I'm trying to think of how to say it without explaining the whole book, but he has it. And in that light, it's the light of a star. And that star was a character from 5,000 years ago that was put up to carry it. And at the end of their playing this out, they're sitting there. And then Sam goes, and why, sir, I've never thought of it before, but you've got some of that light right there in the glass the lady gave you. And now to think of it, that story's still going. And great tales never end, do they? Right. And there's this sense that like part of what the genealogy, part of what the liturgical rhythm, part of what the gospels are not just to be some accounting of the literal facts. They literally canonized 4 of them. And you'll find out if through these weeks that a historian was not the editor.
No.
But it is a thick story for orientation, an orientation to a rhythm and a form of living. And in one of those themes that you raised that really made it pop in that second part, that Act 2 of Matthew is this age to come, is Herod, unlike any leaders we know, has fake conversions to a religion and hopes to seize a number of blind people that aren't aware enough to see the blatant ethical contradictions, and then maybe buys off religious people and has white walls and gold. But the wise man, like when we ask why they're wise, it's precisely that they identified Jesus as king and not Herod, and chose to disobey.
Yep.
And when you think of that other road that the magi took. It's fascinating that magi, these Gentile outsiders, are the first ones, outside of the family, to really model this true allegiance to a kingdom beyond the kind of boundaries that our world kind of impresses on us, because they refuse to comply with imperial tyranny. And when I think of this story in our own present moment, so often, like when we read the gospel stories, there are these huge, grandiose things. You're like, what in the world does my story have to do with freaking Mary and Joseph and Jesus and disciples or whatever? But there's just like one moment the Magi show up, but they did something that contributed to this larger story, and it gave us a model. Like, what would it mean just to dream dreams that you followed if it meant refusing to comply with imperial tyranny because you've identified the true king, and aren't giving in, to the kind of the ideology and structures of power and stuff that a king comes with.
And the fact that they exercise incredible agency in the story. I mean, they're foreigners. They're coming in completely from the outside. They are following a star, and to them, an angel appears in a dream. And the only other person that angel appears in a dream to in this text is Joseph. And so that's interesting in of itself. You have the patriarch figure who's getting a dream. You'd expect that, but then you have these foreigners, and they're also said to be, carrying wisdom, and that the wisdom causes them to go a different way. It causes them to resist. It causes them to say no to an order that would lead to Jesus' death. So they go on, to a different way. And in effect, it's that action that then causes the next reaction. And the next reaction is the worst, in that is Herod commits, mass murder, or would have if he had thought of it. And so that whole text is just, it's rich in its inclusion in some ways, and it does tell us, how to behave under authoritarianism. And you have to wonder, well, what if they would have just gone back? What if they went back? And there's a couple of different possibilities. If they had gone back, maybe they would have decided not to tell Herod where Jesus was, and they would have been killed. Or they told Herod where Jesus was, then Herod would have gone and killed Jesus. I suppose those are the two possibilities if they would have gone the old road. But they decided they go a new road. And so then a whole new part of the story, in effect, opens up. And I think that what opens up there is not the sense of the murder. It's like, oh, well, wouldn't it have been better if all those innocent blood hadn't been shed? And yes, of course, that's the case. But what it does is their choice it reveals, it becomes a revelation of the depth of the evil of this age's kings. And so they are key to this story, is their rebellion against the imperial command shows how wicked Herod is, and shows why you should never give in to these kinds of kings, and why they have to be finally banished from the face of the earth. And the kingship mostly winds up just like that. And that's what God said to Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 8, all of those pages ago in the Bible, when Israel first asked for a king. God said, it's not going to be a good idea. I can tell you, if you have a king, it's going to turn out very bad. And in effect, Herod is the arc of that story. This is what happens. It's very bad. And if you've forgotten, this is you shouldn't forget, because this is the way it's always going to be, unless something else unfolds here.
Yeah.
So I know I think that you could never preach too many sermons on how bad Herod is, by the way.
And it
It's
keeps on getting you
impossible.
better.
It's impossible. And his son isn't much better. And then, of course, you get Pilate introduced as the governor of Galilee. He's in the northern part. So you get a whole bunch of truly horrible imperial figures. So people tell me all the time, this is the thing, Trep, I was just being a little, kind of snarky with Trump. But people tell me all the time, you shouldn't introduce politics into the Gospels. Well, excuse me, the birth narratives, I mean, from the beginning, the Matthew 1 and 2 is political. It is, we get the sacred genealogy. So Matthew 1 is not quite as political, but what it's saying behind the genealogy is this world stinks and is full of corruption and horror. And we are waiting for the age to come. In the meantime, we have this righteous line, and we better stand in this righteous line because this is where we want to be. This is the good place to be. But then as soon as you get into chapter 2, it just like boom, right there. You've got Jesus being called a king and by the king. And if that's not political, I don't know what is. It's the first line in chapter 2, in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. It's like, hello. It's like, and we have that in Luke too. I mean, both of those gospels come up, and you get the Roman figure in Luke, but here in Matthew, you get the Jewish toady president. I mean, this is the President Snow of Judea, and he's the worst, and he's just there because Mark Antony got his name approved by the Roman Senate. I mean, this guy is like he's the Pete Hegseth of the ancient world. And so I got no time for anybody who says, oh, the Gospels aren't political. The Gospels are political, at least Matthew and Luke are, from the very first page.
Yeah. There's also that feature that the Holy Family becomes refugees.
Yes.
And that would mean that the God who became flesh knows what it means to be unwelcome, displaced, and seeking asylum.
Do you know what my very favorite argument about that some people make today is that, oh, they weren't really refugees because there was no border and there were no passports in the ancient world.
All right.
So it's just like, well, one, Egypt knew where Egypt was, and Judea knew where Judea was. And in between them, there was this big wilderness. And so, I'm sorry, there were they were two separate places, geographies. People knew this, and a family moved from one of those geographies to the other geography, and they did it with nobody's permission. So
Yeah.
what is that called?
Yeah, in that the bit about the slaughter of the innocents, that is the most intense moment of violence in the story. Till you get to the cross.
That's right. It is probably in the whole of all four Gospels, except for the cross.
And when you think of, and this is something our friend Dom has talked about plenty of times on the podcast and such. So if people want to hear a long version, they can go ask him. But part of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, was achieved through violence and war and slaughter. And then the empire goes, hey, we brought order and aqueducts, and these kinds of things. And I think by, using the event of the slaughter of the innocents, the children, and then bringing up, right, like the cries of Rachel, right, nesting it back in the whole history of Israel, is to say, yeah, history's normally told and dictated and narrated by the powerful story that's going on. But the mothers of Bethlehem here, just like the mothers who've lost innocent children throughout history, they would beg to differ. And these are the cries that they are given textual, space and set the gospel up, which then a few chapters later, once Jesus starts his ministry, is where you get the Sermon on the Mount. And the way of Christ is very different than the way of Rome. That's where you get turn the other cheek, pray for your enemies, forgive without counting. All the kinds of things that give a whole alternative form of power, possession, and prestige. And so, to me, it seems like one of the, especially the way you kind of laid out the kind of the two acts of like wisdom and the apocalypse, it really frames like what does it look like when wisdom is stating the contrast of an old world passing away with a new one.
Mhm.
Well, you know what better way to do it? A classic sermon, like one on a mount, right? Like it is the perfect prologue if that's if
that's
that's
what
what
you're
you're setting
doing.
up. Yeah.
And it's interesting that the story that gets you there, the next piece that appears right after chapter 2 is the John the Baptist story. And they come to John the Baptist to say, "Are you the one? Are you the one?" And John the Baptist says, "No, I'm not. I'm not the one. This is a pretty cool baptism, but there's one who's going to come, and he's going to baptize with spirit and fire." And I think that's really intriguing with the wisdom piece because, in effect, spirit and fire, wisdom and apocalypse. And it's like, oh my gosh, I literally had so much fun learning that potential interpretation of what the literary structure is of this book, and it just opened up a whole bunch of stuff for me that was really really helpful. And so John the Baptist then tells us outright who this Jesus is. He is both one who is the hinge of history, the fire, as it were, and he is also the one who is wisdom incarnate, the spirit. And then you move, and the next place you are is the Sermon on the Mount, basically. And so the teaching then begins to unfold from that announcement of John in chapter 3. So I hope that anybody here who's a pastor, we've started giving you great ideas, because if you're in a mainline church, you're going to be preaching from Matthew all year. This is just the beginning. It's really a stunning opening. And the challenge, of course, is to not preach it in the way that integrates it with Luke. I mean, if you're sticking purely to the lectionary this year, and you don't want to do that integration piece, you want to let this story really stand on its own. And of course, people will be singing carols about cows and stalls and stuff. But to remind your congregations that the narratives are different and that they're serving different purposes. But I think, as we're going to explore, is that the ultimate dramatic story that's in all four of these gospels is somehow that apocalyptic piece. And it's expressed in four different ways, depending upon how the author has chosen to shade and, fill out the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been fun.
Yeah, it has been. And I hope that people did like the two acts thing, because I think that really works. This chapter 1's like act 1, chapter 2's like act 2. And in act 2 there's 3 scenes. And the scenes are the first is the deception, where Herod tries to deceive the wise men. And then the wise men wind up at the end of that scene deceiving Herod, as it were, of rebelling against Herod. Scene 2 is the consequence, Joseph's and the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, and the murder. So that's what happens when tyranny doesn't get its way. Is that you get refugees, you get people who have to flee for their lives, and you get people who lose their lives. So that's the imperial violence piece, and they're both wrapped up together. And then scene 3 is the return. And I think in the return, you get this subtle reference to Joseph, is that you get the idea of God has worked through this, even though it was also Herod is evil. Herod is dead, and now they can come back and try to be this family, and that Jesus as the wisdom figure, Jesus as the preacher of the hinge of history, now he's home, and something is going to happen next. And so you have to take him back to Judea, in order. Well, they moved to Galilee, but they have to go back to the Holy Land in order for the next thing to happen, the next part of the story.
Yeah, there was one other question that we hadn't talked on at all about the star, and I would just it was something about it connected to imperial imagery, and I'd just say I don't know how the star works on imperial imagery, but when you think of how the Gospel of Matthew ends, with the Great Commission, right, sending out to make disciples who embody this. What does wisdom look like incarnate? Go teach them, make them my disciples to live this out. That dynamic, is kind of anticipated with the arrival of this wisdom. Isn't something that is first identified by the Jewish religious elite or Herod or anyone. It's identified by the Magi. That the coming of wisdom is not just for one people, but for all, right? And then it ends that way. But I don't. That was the connection I saw. I don't. But I would
So
have to email
I
Dom
got
and
so
ask
into
about
the story is that
why.
I didn't even get a chance to mention the star, and I don't really know either. I mean, I've always just sort of thought of the star as a sign of, in some senses, the foreignness of these people. These are astrologers. These are mediums.
Yeah.
And so they're following the sort of spiritual tools that they know in order to be able to behold wisdom face to face. And so I've always really kind of just thought about it on the instrumental sort of level. But hey, I'm going to now
And
look.
Advent, we use light all the time.
We do. Where would we be without those candles? But now I'm going to go and I'm going to look that piece up too, because
Yeah.
I think that this is one of those. These two chapters are in and of themselves a birth narrative that every detail matters, and I encourage people, go in with those different eyes. Don't look for what you think look for what surprises you, and keep always front and center that the Jewishness of this, and that it's a very dualistic text, and be looking for all of the echoes of the Hebrew scriptures that are showing up in these stories, and where Matthew is clearly referring back. I mean, and like the Joseph connection, I think, is fascinating, and you don't hear that very often. You hear Moses, and that's good, because you should, because that's clearly part of what Matthew is doing. But I think that the Joseph piece is really beautifully subtle, that's woven through this whole story.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining live. Next week, same time, we'll talk about the Gospel of Mark, and then Luke, and then John. If you haven't joined up and joined, because this one is streaming publicly to lure those of you who want to know what we are going to do, then head over to homebrewedclasses.com. And all of you that have joined, know you've gotten an email. If you haven't got it, then you should let me know. Then it probably went to spam or something like that. It will get fixed. Class info at homebrewedchristianity.com. The email to send it if you have a problem, it's right there on the sign up page. If you start clicking through it, and it says, if you didn't get an email, then let me know. Do it, and David will help you out, because there's a link to a page where we will put the recordings of each session on there so you can use them. I know there are like 700 or 800 of you who've been joining live this time. But if you wanted to go back and grab it, or if you're one of the people that aren't joining live, they'll always be there, so you can go back and use them, at your own pace. Next week is Mark. I know someone already put a question about Mark in the chat. You should email that to me. But next week, Gospel of Mark, the oldest one, and there's no little baby Jesus in Mark. So how does Mark begin a gospel about the advent of Christ? He gets right to the point. It gets exciting. And
Don't give it away.
I spent way too much time reading historical stuff about Vespian this week. So I'm sure I'm going to talk about that.
See, I've just been it just sort of entrenched in Jewish history this week. That was my job. That was my homework.
Yes. Yes. So